please feel free to do so that we can get to know each other's faces. And some of us are in COVID restrictions, so it's a nice bonding time with our brothers and sisters. And good morning to Jonathan, he's just joined us. So I am going to record this just for your information. But good morning, everybody. My name is Mansheed, and I will be your this morning's host, MC. But before we begin our wonderful program, I'd like to welcome you all firstly. But if I can just remind everybody to just, at this stage, to mute yourselves, please. You can leave your video on. So please mute yourselves, and you can always, while you're listening to the discussions, and if a question comes up, you can always type in the chat box your questions, and I'll make sure that I go through those as well. But we will have a Q&A in the program. Before we begin, I'd like to do a little acknowledgement of country, not a little, but a proper acknowledgement. And I'd like to acknowledge our elders upon the land which we are meeting. And that side, I'd like to acknowledge across New South Wales, ACT, Melbourne, I think Port Macquarie, if I'm not mistaken, Ross, and wherever else you are joining us from around Australia. Thank you for coming to the Muslim Christian Academic Dialogue, formerly known as Scriptural Reasoning. As you may have received the invitation from Clive and myself, we really tried hard to organize this session earlier on, but we were going to do it on climate change. But unfortunately, that sort of didn't kick off because of COVID, sadly. So nevertheless, we had a program planned for the 9th, and we thought, hey, we'll just go online. Though we couldn't meet face to face, we decided to still continue. And in solidarity with our Melbourne friends and those of other regional areas who can't make it, we thought we'll make this online. So this is a shorter version of what you would have normally had face to face. We hope that you join us and continue to be with us in future sessions, and next year we'll have our full program, hopefully with COVID behind us. Okay, so our theme this morning is, you know, the obvious COVID, but particularly we were interested in looking at theological responses from a Christian Muslim perspective. And we will be listening to two friends and colleagues from the Christian community and two academics and colleagues from the Muslim community. Just before we begin, Clive reminded me that the topic or the program was going to be called Christian Muslim Academic Dialogue, but we couldn't go ahead with that because there's the short form of that would have been CMAD. So we stuck to Muslim Christian Academic Dialogue, so it's MCAD. Yeah, just a little joke. I will give that to Clive. Thank you for that little insight. Okay, I will quickly share my screen now, and I'll show you the program before I hand over to our first speaker. Can I just remind everyone who's just entered to please mute yourselves until you're speaking, and you will have a chance to speak in Q&A. We are a little bit short in time, so we need to stick to our time as best as possible. So if you'd like to still participate, while a thought comes to your mind, feel free to use the chat box and type. So I'll just quickly share my screen so that I can you see my messy screen? Okay, so this is the program for tonight, you guys. So we will be responding to COVID-19 is our theme, exploring theological issues and resources of our traditions. So we'll have our first speaker in a minute. That's Dr. Hakan. He'll be explaining to the pandemics and responding to some Quranic and prophetic traditions. Our first Christian speaker will then speak, who's Professor Clive Pearson, and he will talk about theological symptoms. Following our first two speakers, we will have Q&A, but I will have to be quite, particular with the time. So please don't think I'm a Nazi. I'll turn on my screen and I'll give you like a bit of a hand, 2 minutes or 1 minute sort of thing. And then we'll go straight to our second part, which is our Associate Professor Mehmet Ozalp, who will be our Muslim speaker, talking to us on theological perspectives and the impact of COVID-19 for Muslims. Then our Christian speaker is Professor Stephen Pickard from Public and Contextual Theology. So it's good that he's supporting us and he's also speaking. He always supports our forum, so which is fantastic. The Research Centre does, and they produce wonderful research. And then following that, our second speaker, we will then have a short Q&A again. Now, the purpose of this is also to engage other academics like yourselves and theologians in your fields, both Christians and Muslims. So we will also have a session where we will break out. So don't be alarmed. I'll put you into Christian Muslim groups, although I like to muddle you up sometimes. But for this time, I'll just try my best to allocate the Christians to one breakout room and Muslims. So we have an internal dialogue and understanding of the other, like what we've heard this morning. And then we'll resume collectively at 11:55 for a collective reflection. And before we do a farewell, I'm very pleased to say that at 12:10, we'll publicly launch today the book that hasn't yet been launched and edited by Professor Clive, Pearson, Enacting a Public Theology. And we'll briefly do that before we end. Okay, so that's the program. You won't hear from me much. I won't interrupt the pace. So our first speaker is from the Center of Islamic Studies and Civilization, CISAC, Charles Sturt University, Dr. Hakan Coruh. Hakan, you should be able to share your screen if you need to, or you can speak when you're ready.
If you allow me to speak, if you allow me to present.
There's an echo in your voice though, Hakan. So I'm not sure if because you're in the same room as Mehmet, but yeah, try again.
But I'm not connected.
All right. I'm muted as well.
You're muted?
Yes.
Okay, we're having echo.
Yeah, there's a bit of an echo.
Yeah.
Are you on mute?
Yes.
I'm muted your computer.
That's the fun parts of technology. It facilitates getting us all together, but it can also cause little hiccup.
Don't mute yourself on thing. Yeah. Open up there.
Yeah, that's better.
All right. It is okay now?
I don't know what's
Hakan, you have to mute yourself on your laptop.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Hakan Sahel from Melbourne just said mute yourself on your laptop.
He's muted. Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Maybe you want to zoom in on the video, Brother Mehmet. Please go.
Just sorry. Can you all hear me?
Can you just acknowledge that we can hear Hakan?
Can you all hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right. My apologies. Sorry. Yes. If you allow me to, present. Yes. All right. Yeah. All right. Can you see my presentation all?
Yep, we can see. Go.
All right. Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to thank United Theological College and PaCT and CISAC for organizing this event. I believe that it is a very meaningful event during these difficult times. And of course, reading together our scriptures, respectful traditions, and how they understand this pandemic and what are included in our respectful traditions are very important. And also understanding, or receiving fresh theological understanding from other tradition, and also advancing truth together. I believe that very important. In my talk, I'm going to focus on pandemics in the Quran and Sunnah. And this workshop, one of the questions was, what our traditions include or possess about this pandemic? And Dr. Mehmet will talk about theological issues raised from this pandemic. pandemics in the Quran and Sunnah. When we say Sunnah, Hadith, prophetic traditions, contents of this, my presentation will be concepts of ta'un and weba, which terms specifically are used in the Quran and prophetic traditions, Hadith. I will focus a little bit. Then after that, pandemics in the Quran, if there is any verse, if in the Quran or not about this issue, pandemics, epidemics, pandemics in Hadith, prophetic traditions. Then after that, hygiene, maintenance of health in the Quran and Hadith. Of course, this is a common area among religious traditions, hygiene, hifz al-siha. When we look at religious traditions, Christian tradition, Jewish traditions such as Maimonides, they have also works and books on this concept, hifz al-siha, hygiene as well. All right. Epidemics and similar pandemics are not uncommon in human history. Of course, when we look at history, we see other pandemics as well, globally affected, such as the Black Death. Religious belief and practice cover many aspects of the life, such that believers will seek religious guidance in how to respond to mass threats to public health. In turn, religious guidance can motivate faith communities in the face of anxiety and panic and help to reduce the spread of the virus. This presentation will analyze widespread disease and pandemics in the Quran and Hadith, included in major Hadith collections, about what information is included and what approaches and guidance is provided in these traditions. Two concepts are very crucial in the main scripture of Islam, Quran and prophetic tradition, ta'un and weba, because generally, in English we say plague or pandemics, but specifically Hadith, prophetic traditions include the term ta'un or sometimes weba, all right? Two Arabic terms are mainly used to refer to epidemic diseases or the plague, in prophetic traditions, ta'un and epidemic disease, plague, or synonyms, weba. According to some Arabic linguists, ta'un is the name of all epidemic diseases. Of course, there are discussions among Arabic linguistics and also Muslim scholars and theologians. For example, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya considers ta'un as a part of weba. Weba is a general term for epidemic diseases. Ta'un is part of weba. But mostly ta'un, the concept of ta'un is used in prophetic traditions. Sometimes weba is used. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, very famous hadith scholars in Islamic history, and he has a super commentary on the most authentic hadith collection, which is called Bukhari, Sahih al-Bukhari. He has a very great super commentary, and he experienced pandemic as well. Despite the sadness of losing his children, he lost his three daughters, all right, during this pandemic, and he wrote a 400-page encyclopedia on various aspects of the pandemics, such as religious edicts on epidemics, the origin of epidemics, what one needs to do during epidemics, and he discussed in great detail the famous hadith on plague, which I'm gonna refer to soon, narrated by two important companions. And this book is considered as the masterpiece on the jurisprudence of law of epidemics. Fiqh, as you know, is one of the major Islamic disciplines, Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic law. It focuses on behavior, actions, and rulings in daily life, and it includes ethics as well, all right? Very normative discipline, fiqh. And this book is very crucial. How Ibn Hajar describes ta'un, although ta'un may have the generic sense of an epidemic, it is used constantly in the late medieval Arabic text in the specific sense of a plague. Almost every plague treatise from the Black Death to the 19th century distinguishes between the general terminology for epidemic diseases and the plague. General term for epidemic is weba. The following statement, which is found in these treatises, makes the distinction clear. Every ta'un, plague, is a weba, but not every weba is a ta'un. Ta'un, plague, is a part of weba. Just little bit information about these two crucial terms which are included in in hadith traditions, specifically in prophetic tradition. When we look at the Quran, there is not much materials on the plug in the Quran. And this term is not used in the Quran. Specifically in hadith sources, there are several hadith, prophetic traditions narrated and relate back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. There is not much materials, but some Quran commentators interpret the concept of rijz, the term rijz, punishment, for one tribe from Israelites in the history of Israelites as ta'un. They interpret as ta'un. Surah Araf, verse 130 to 135, Quran says, we inflicted years of drought and crop failure on Pharaoh's people so that they might take heed. But then after that, God, punished them according to this passage. And of course, after, as you can see, we lose on them the flood, locusts, lice, frogs, blood, all clear signs. But then after Moses, they were arrogant and wicked people. They would say, whenever a plague struck them, Moses, actually, translator Abdul Halim used here as plague, but actually rijz, punishment, literally. But I think he accepted commentators' interpretation here. Moses, pray to your Lord for us for virtue of the promise he has made to you. If you relieve us of the plague, we will believe you and let the children of Israel go with you. But when we relieved them of the plague and gave them a fixed period, but behold, they broke it, in which to fulfill their promise, and behold, they broke it. So some Quran commentators, such as Tabari, interpret rijz, the term rijz in these verses, literally means punishment, in order to refer to, they interpret as the plague, ta'un. As I said, just interpretation, but there is no clear indication in the Quran. And mostly pandemics, ta'un, plague are contained in prophetic traditions, hadith traditions. Plague hadith are included under a specific title in major hadith collections called the Book of Medicine, Kitab al-Tib. The Book of Medicine in major hadith collections such as Bukhari and Muslim. Sahih Bukhari, Book of Medicine, Kitab al-Tib. And after book titles include subheadings, chapters, and chapter Babu ma yudhkaru fi ta'un, what has been mentioned about the plague, and relevant hadith, prophetic traditions are included under this chapter. But in addition to these, this part, the Book of Medicine, other parts of hadith collections, such as the Book of Sicknesses, include important points with regard to cleanliness and the maintenance of health, hifz or hygiene. For example, very famous hadith, if you hear about the plague, an outbreak of plague in a land, do not go to it. Do not go to it. But if plague breaks out in a country where you are staying, do not run away from it. This is very famous prophetic tradition, hadith, and authentic hadith narrated by Bukhari, the most authentic collection of hadith, and a very famous hadith of Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him. As you can see, medical isolation actually is indicated here. And in Islamic history, the second Caliph, Umar, departed for Syria, and when he reached a specific place, the commanders of the Muslim army, Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah, and his companions met him and told him that an epidemic, as you can see in this report, waba is used. An epidemic had broken out in Syria, in that region. Umar said, call for me the early immigrants. So Umar called them and consulted them and informed them that an epidemic had broken out in Syria. Those people differed in their opinions, but another companion of the Prophet, I have some knowledge about this, and he narrated from the Prophet that if you hear about the plague in a land, do not go to it. But if plague breaks out in a country where you are staying, do not run away from it. And Omar thanked God and returned to Medina. He did not enter to that place. Of course, here Omar preferred, of course, people's health over maybe public benefits, through this military expedition. There are other reports as well. In another report, the Prophet said, one should run away from the leper as one runs away from a lion. Narrated by Bukhari, as you can see, book of medicine again. The Prophet also used to say, "Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from leprosy, madness, elephantiasis, and evil diseases," narrated by Abu Dawud. These prophetic reports show that how he paid special attention to such epidemics and viruses, and made some recommendations to prevent the spread of viruses. In addition to medical isolation, these reports, prophetic traditions indicate medical isolation. The Prophet himself would sometimes keep a certain distance from people with a contagious disease. For example, he accepted a leper's pledge to loyalty by his words and avoided physical contact, narrated by Muslim. In order to prevent the spread of the disease to other people, when the Prophet would sneeze, he would cover his face with his hand or with his garment and muffle the sound with it. And this practice of the Prophet, we say a normative behavior of the Prophet, which is called as sunnah of the Prophet, looks more meaningful today in the face of the coronavirus pandemic, as medical experts strongly emphasize covering your mouth and nose when you cough or sneeze. Another chapter under the book of medicine chapter, the reward of a person who suffers from plague and remains patient. Again in Bukhari, narrated by Aisha, the wife of the Prophet. She asked the Prophet about plague, and he informed her, saying plague was a punishment which Allah used to send on whom he wished. In the early history, punishment was on a tribe from Israelite, according to reports. But God made it a blessing for the believers. None among the believers remains patient in a land in which plague has broken out and considers that nothing will befall him except what Allah has ordained for him, but that Allah will grant him a reward similar to that of a martyr. In this reward, people are encouraged to remain patient, sabr, we say in Arabic, in Islamic tradition, and rely on God after taking all the necessary medical precautions. The reward of a person who suffers from plague and remains patient will be similar to that of a shaheed. Of course, in this report, two expressions are important: remaining patient, to be patient, and also believing that nothing will befall him except what God has ordained for him. To be patient, to stop ourselves from despairing, panicking, to stop our tongues from complaining, to stop our hands from striking our faces and tearing our clothes at times of grief and stress, or to exhibit patience in the face of sudden dangers. Difficulties is considered to be one of the types of patience commanded in the Qur'an. Of course, every believer can have patience at unlawful things, but it is only the prophets, maybe high spiritual level people, can have patience in the face of natural calamities. For this reason, the Prophet said, "Oh God, I pray to you to grant me such a firm faith as can make dangers and difficulties from you easy on me." We can understand from this supplication that the firm faith, which say yaqeen, is linked with patience, sabr. And Fakhreddin Razi, another very famous theologian, Muslim theologian, and his tafsir is like a Summa Theologia of Thomas Aquinas, very influential Ash'ari theologian. When humans experience a severe calamity and disaster and think it is beyond human power and nobody can help them, it is as if they are in their natural disposition, fitrah we say, and they become submissive to the one who can save them from it. Afflictions and misfortunes are testing times for humans, and their actions during such times are of particular importance. These are testing times for humans. And God says, "We shall certainly test you with fear and hunger, loss of property, lives and crops. But, O Prophet, give good news to those who are patient, steadfast, and those who say, when afflicted with a calamity, we belong to God, and to Him we shall return. In Surah Baqarah, 2nd chapter. If, according to Islamic sources, if this worldly realm is the field of testing, then sicknesses, misfortunes will be a part of this testing. If humans are steadfast and patient, according to the hadith which I narrated, they will succeed in this test. Also, such testing times and tribulations are a call for humans to reflect on themselves, life and its meaning, their connection with the world, and for prayer for humans and help each other. Such misfortunes should be signs and lessons for believers. Another report, if he who dies of an abdominal disease is a martyr, is a shaheed, and someone who dies of plague is a martyr, he is shaheed. We hope that God will grant those innocent people who died during this pandemic a reward from the treasure of His divine mercy, and a sort of martyrdom for them in return for the tribulations they suffered. And hygiene, the maintenance of health, also in the Quran and Hadith, are very, actually is very crucial and very important topic. As I said, hygiene and hifz al-siha is included among religious traditions, as I said before, in Christian tradition, Jewish tradition. Of course, Quran and prophetic traditions include important points with regard to this topic, and specifically during Abbasid period, Muslim and non-Muslim scientists and scholars in Baghdad, they translated Indian and Greek medicine. Of course, this developed further this area. As I said, Ibn Maimonides and other Christian scholars, they also contribute to this area. This is hygiene, or hifz al-siha, we say in Arabic, the maintenance of health. And in general, religions deal with human health and medicine. Cleanliness is highlighted in the Quran. And God loves those who keep themselves clean. Ablution is made obligatory upon believers for 5 daily prayers. And many prophetic traditions discuss various aspects of cleanliness and hygiene. Many hadith collections start with a chapter titled The Book on Purification, Kitab al-Tahara. And in one prophetic tradition, the Prophet says, cleanliness is half of faith. And personal hygiene, body cleanliness also is considered as a natural disposition of human beings. And dental health and hygiene also is emphasized. And cleaning houses, streets, and environments are also highlighted. And many other hadith with regard to hygiene. Also, there are many other hadith with regard to hygiene as well. I have included 3 reports here, but because of the time, I am skipping. And there are some I have come across some special supplications on plague. I have just included one example here. Imam Ghazali, very famous Ash'ari theologian, and his treatise, or his chapter of supplication called Junnatul Asma. And on the left side, as you can see, Lil Hifz min at-ta'un. In order to protect yourself from ta'un, from plague, read this supplication. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Fardun Hayyun Qayyumun Hakamun Adlun Quddus. These are names of God, from 99 names of God. Sayyidallahu ba'da usrin yusra. God will make it easy after hardship. And awaman kana maytan fa ahyaynahu. This is another verse cited from the Quran. Conclusion, Mansheed, I'm concluding. Quran and particularly prophetic traditions contain important materials on the plague and provide theological and practical teachings. How to approach, how to believe, or how to act. Prophetic traditions include both creedal and practical guidelines, such as remaining patient and relying on God. For people of faith, afflictions and misfortunes are testing times, and such testing times and tribulations are a call for contemplation. These misfortunes are considered as signs and lessons for believers. According to the Quran and prophetic traditions, believers must remain patient in the face of calamities, relying on God and fully becoming aware that God is in full control of their affairs. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Dr. Hakan, let's give him a virtual clap like I am, if you can find the icon. Thank you for taking us through the Islamic tradition and what you had to offer there. I guess, although, you know, we're speaking from our theologies, it's as Christians and Muslims, we can look to our traditions to inform us on how to behave and perhaps respond responsibly in some ways in our modern context. So next we'll hear from our Christian speaker and academic, Professor Clive Pearson, who will talk to us about theological symptoms. So over to you, Clive, and maybe if you can stop sharing, Hakan. Thank you so much, Hakan. We'll please stay with us. We will have Q&A as well after Clive's presentation. Clive, when you're ready.
Well, thank you, Mansheed, and I'm very glad that friends from Melbourne, Port Macquarie, Orange and Canberra could join with us online in this time. The most immediate response of the Christian faith through its churches were practical. The virus had struck so suddenly. One moment it was over there. The timeline of statistics in the Sydney Morning Herald was running the equivalent of a league ladder, indicating the number of deaths and infections in places like Italy, Spain, and the UK. Then it was here. Before us lay questions of its impact on lives, the capacity of the health system, the resilience and quality of civil society, the economy, immediate and long term. The pressure on the liturgical and pastoral life of the Christian faith was immediate. The public health advisories cut into the season of Lent and the preparation for Easter. The burden of time and energy was directed towards the practice of being the church. Was it possible to initiate a digital ecclesiology that maintained the regular rhythm of worship online, pastoral care in a time of social distancing, the nurture of spiritual life, the sustaining of ministry in a season of lockdown and closed doors, in addition to which there is the practical governance of the church and the need to negotiate the tension between being a citizen and a disciple. These things are important. COVID-19 has not yet matched the deadly impact of past pandemics like the Black Death of the 14th century. But there are lessons to be learned from the times when the church failed to meet the challenge of a surging wave of death. Joshua Mark and Philip Ziegler, for instance, have noted this plague exposed the failings of the medieval church. In terms of the current response, what has been less to the fore was explicit biblical and theological reflection. That should not come as too much of a surprise. It takes time to do such work. Theology is always a second-order reflection. It requires a degree of critical distance, and the theology of pandemics has hardly been a key matter of interest for the past century or so. The rise of COVID-19 has taken contemporary theology a little by surprise and underprepared, though as the Lutheran social commentator Lyman Stone has noted, the Christian faith has been dealing with pandemics for 2,000 years. What Stone's comment infers is that theology does have a history upon which to draw. COVID-19 is not the same as SARS and AIDS, nor the bubonic plague, nor the Antonine plague and the plague of Cyprian, though these last two may indeed have been the first recorded accounts of a virus transferred from an animal host to humans. The societies which those much earlier plagues ravaged are not the same as those of today's complexity. They lack the expert and professional medical capacity of currently highly developed societies. They do nevertheless perform the function of an analogy, a foil for the theological work before us today. It is time for biblical scholars, theologians, and the church in general to acknowledge the importance of the role of professional church historians. This backstory is both inspirational and colourful. It has been claimed that a quarter of the Roman Empire was killed off during the Antonine Plague. One of the things which stood out in this period was the ethical example and conduct of early Christians. They stood out for their care of the sick. They acted out an exemplary life whereby plagues were not to be seen as the work of an angry and capricious gods. They were rather the consequence of a broken creation, an imperfect creation yet to be reconciled to a loving God. This dimension of sacrificial care was more strongly evident in the plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century. Cyprian was the Bishop of Carthage. He lamented, "Many of us are dying from this plague and pestilence." His sermons advised his hearers not to grieve for plague victims because, as he said, they were now in heaven. In this life, the disease was affecting the just and the unjust. And for those who bear the name of Christ, this mortality, this destruction, becomes a way of gladly seeking martyrdom while we are learning not to fear death. It is a time of testing whereby the mind of the human race is examined. The just care for the sick, their relatives care for their kin, the masters show compassion for their ailing slaves. Cyprian. Dionysius was the Bishop of Alexandria. Rodney Stark observed that maybe 2/3 of the city's population died from this disaster, more frightening than anything before, that Dionysius described in his Easter message as coming out of the blue. Yet it should not be seen as a time of distress. The bishop reflected on how Christians, heedless of danger, took charge of the sick, attending to their every need. They did so in a way that marked them out as different. In subsequent centuries, the pagan emperor Julian observed that these impious Galileans, as he called them, would care for even non-Christian sick people. Their benevolence to strangers and their care of the graves of the dead, so he said, stood out in an exemplary fashion. The church historian Pontianus likewise noted how Christians ensured that good was done to all, not merely to the household of faith. This sacrificial response was not isolated to this period in time. The transition to our present period can be made through Martin Luther. The bubonic plague struck Wittenberg in 1527, and Luther refused calls to leave the city, and that refusal would cost him his daughter Elizabeth. What comes down to us now is his tract from the time, whether Christians should flee the plague. It has not attracted the same kind of attention as Luther's great treatises which sparked the Reformation, but it stands out as a clear presentation of a Christian response to an epidemic. There is a distinction to be made between those who hold office and those who do not. With reference to the former, Lyman Stone notes, "We die at our posts. Christian doctors cannot abandon their hospitals. Christian governors cannot flee their districts. Christian pastors cannot abandon their congregations." Some of that happened during the Black Death. Luther indeed had a keen sense of the need to maintain municipal homes and hospitals, adequately staffed to care for the sick. Such institutions should be sustained by pious legacies. With regard to the latter, Luther emphasized how our people are mutually bound together. We cannot desert one another or flee from one another. Whoever wants to serve Christ in person would surely serve his neighbor as well. Luther argues that no one should dare leave his neighbor unless there are others who will take care of the sick in their stead and nurse them. That is the test. If someone is weak and fearful, let him flee in God's name, as long as he does not neglect his duty towards his neighbor, but has made adequate provision for others to provide nursing care. In a manner that might anticipate anti-vaxxers and those who protest against masks and social distancing, Luther takes to task those who are much too rash and reckless, tempting God and disregarding everything which might counteract death and the plague. They disdain the use of medicines. They do not avoid places and persons infected by the plague, but lightheartedly make sport of it and wish to prove how independent and free they are. They say that it is God's punishment, and if he wants to protect them, he can do so without medicines or our carefulness. This is not trusting God, Luther wrote, but tempting him. God has created medicines and provided us with intelligence to guard and take good care of the body so that we can live in good health. Luther suggests how those who have contracted the disease and now recovered should conduct themselves. He is particularly condemning of those who keep their infection a secret and in so doing contaminate and poison others. The judge should take them by the ear and turn them over to Master Jack the hangman as outright and deliberate murders, he wrote. Rodney Stark has observed that faced with these kind of threats, faiths, religions are faced with a crisis. The religion is either unable to furnish a satisfactory understanding of why the disaster has occurred, it has failed to provide meaning, or the religion has shown itself to be unavailing, which stark means it has failed to be a source of help. What is striking about the Christian responses to these two early plagues is that they were found to be exemplary. Cyprian and Luther may have both inhabited worlds where they understood a pandemic to be a divine punishment, but at the same time, their responses were also informed by the call to love the neighbour, the one in need, and to do so in the case of Cyprian more overtly, with a view to participate in the sufferings of Christ. That's a regular refrain in Cyprian's sermons, to participate in the sufferings of Christ. What was evident in these historical responses was the way in which action, conduct, character at its best was bound up with ways of reading the Bible and theological claims. What you do was not separate from what you believe. So far, the level of formal biblical and theological reflection on COVID-19 has been relatively sparse. The tendency has been to look to the Synod in our case for advice on what we can do and what we can't do, and that is determined by the public health advisories of the state government. Into this relative vacuum can be set a handful of readings and writings that address a number of theological symptoms provoked by the crisis. Short books have been written by Tom Wright, John Piper, and Walter Brueggemann. But I want to first concentrate on one of the more recent responses, a document sent to me last week by Seth Carroll in Geneva. It's been put out by the World Council of Churches and the Pontifical Council for the Interreligious Dialogue. It's called Serving a Wounded World in Interreligious Solidarity, and it describes itself as a response to the question, what does it mean for Christians to love and serve our fellow human beings in a world in which COVID-19 pandemic has inflicted widespread suffering? Framed in this way, it should come as no surprise that the text is shaped by a reading of the parable of the Good Samaritan. For Muslim colleagues, this parable is set inside a context of Jesus addressing the question, who is my neighbour? It anticipates the command to love one's neighbour as oneself. The storyline of the parable revolves around the response of travellers to a wounded man who had been set upon along the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. It so happens that members of the wounded man's own faith hurry by without helping. The one who stops to do so is the Samaritan, who represents for us the one who is the other, regarded with suspicion and by extension, the one reckoned least likely to assist. In due course in this document, the parable is bound up with a reading of Matthew 25. The one who is wounded becomes the representative of all suffering, Christ's co-suffering with the world. Through this coming of the text, the document imagines that we encounter the face of the suffering Christ in the one who is suffering. It is evident that through this use of the parable, that the two councils are emphasizing the importance of service, solidarity, and the desire to overcome religious prejudice and cultural biases in order to alleviate suffering and nurture the common good. The two councils believe this strategy is necessary because the whole of humanity is gravely wounded. Our interdependence reminds us that no one can be saved on their own. The councils further assume that the COVID-19 pandemic cannot be separated from the broader context of the suffering of this planet. The two councils see this health crisis indeed as a harbinger of future crises relating to climate change and the assault on biodiversity. It fits in here with the intention of A.J.P. Hampton's forthcoming anthology, Pandemic, Ecology, Theology, Perspectives on COVID-19. The two councils are thus inclined to set their response within an existing ecumenical agenda, which goes back to declarations of justice, peace, and the integrity of creation, as well as a subsequent concern for the poor and marginalized of the world. These are admirable themes, but one wonders if there is an unacknowledged cost here. Is there sufficient engagement with the specificity of the virus and the menace it poses? there is a worrying lack of engagement with pandemic health experts. The tendency of this document is to favour a set of values and guiding principles. Those which are named are humility and vulnerability, respect for the individual, the intersection of community, compassion and the common good, and the call for dialogue and mutual learning, and the call to live out Christ's love. The theological foundations of these values are established initially in the Christian claim that all people are created in the image of God. This common dignity is sustained by hope. Serving a wounded world interprets a Christian hope along the lines of God's promised kingdom, in which the whole creation is reconciled and bound together in justice and peace. It imagines that this hope can transform lives in the present and lead to service. It argues the case for a universal and shared ethic and spiritual values to inject a new hope in the pandemic-ravaged world. The dilemma raised by such familiar language is that it runs the risk of playing down the particularity of religious beliefs. Serving a wounded world touches upon biblical and theological ideas in a rather light way. It bears the mark of belief in the triune God confessed by the Christian faith, and it will refer to isolated texts like those of 1 Peter 2:4. Our trust and hope is in Jesus Christ who heals by his wounds, but doesn't do enough. It is worth perhaps putting alongside it the response of Tom Wright, writing initially an article in Time, and then in due course a short book, God and the Pandemic. Wright is a noted evangelical writer, and he is well aware of what kind of people those of us who are of Western background are. For that purpose, he draws upon a typology from the ancient world. The Stoic declares that you can't change things, thus you need to learn to fit in. The Epicurean would suggest that we should make ourselves as comfortable as we can until it passes, while the Platonist thinks along the lines that we are destined for a different world, so what's the problem? Wright reckons that most of us in the modern West are basically Epicureans. The pandemic is here. Let's settle down, self-isolate if and when needs be. Then there is plenty of Netflix and this too will pass. One of the first theological tasks Wright addressed was essentially negative. In a time of crisis, there is always a need to refute bad theology. It is imperative in this case to take issue with conspiracy theories and assume that this deadly virus is the work of an angry God directed at a particular groups of people. And if you want to find out how that plays itself out in practice, just start Googling away and you will see all sorts of conspiracy theories and blames. There have been numerous instances of this. The soft option to blame others and be distracted. Wright is very skeptical of those who want to suggest that God is trying to say something through the pandemic and that it should be seen as a result of God's dislike of specific sets of people. Wright further is critical of those who might wish to say the virus is a sign of the impending end of the world, which is a line of argument to be found in John Piper's Coronavirus and Christ. In place of that talk of punishment, Wright reads the Hebrew Bible where humankind inhabits a good creation. It is one in which there is a dark power that manifests itself in awkward circumstances, gross injustices, terrible plagues, being accused of wicked things even though one is innocent. Wright takes us into the world of Psalms and the book of Job, as well as prophetic literature. We are to state the case as it is, and we are to place these things in the care of God. Wright is thus imitating the pattern of a protest theodicy. It is a line of approach he will carry into his reading of Jesus, the New Testament, and what do we do from here? Nearly there. Wright addresses these themes not found in Serving the Wounded World. He draws upon biblical text after biblical text, but does so in a way which the appropriate Christian response is deemed to be one of lament, the groaning with creation, praying in the power of the Spirit, and serving, especially the poor, and defending their interests. The difficulty in the way in which he plays down the more prophetic and apocalyptic tradition of the Bible. It leaves his response in a form of quietism expressed in lament, prayer, and faithful service. It does not follow that the biblical script in any way those traditions also deal with the clash of nations and empires, It leaves them like abstractions. Does this leave his reading of the pandemic to remove from multiple crises facing contemporary humanity and planetary well-being? There is not a sense of judgment in this interpretation of God and the pandemic, and yet maybe the pandemic represents a different form of judgment from that which Cyprian and Luther envisaged as a personal subjective level. Is the pandemic one more symptom alongside a raft of other symptoms in the form of a wake-up call? Final paragraph. It should come as no surprise that the first response to COVID-19 was one of practical digital ecclesiology, marked by health and safety concerns. The past experience of the church is that pandemics possess theological symptoms as well. They raise questions to do with how we talk about God, Christ, the gospel, problems of theodicy and hope. The tension this pandemic raises lies between the need to make some sort of meaning about the virus itself, and if and how it should also be seen in a much broader canvas of what is happening planetary-wise. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Clive. A wonderful and eloquent presentation, and Dr. Hakan. Okay, everybody, we are, like I said in the chat box, we have time for about 2 to 3 questions, about 2 questions maximum. And we'll have a longer time at the end of all the presentations and discussion. So, yeah, let's give Clive a virtual round of applause, firstly, before I forget. Thank you, Clive. Excellent. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so anyone have a pressing question? So we need maybe 1 question for the Muslim speaker and 1 question for the Christian speaker. So we've heard a great deal of wealth of information. So if you can just put your hand up, or you can just wave at me when you want to ask a question. Time's ticking. Oh, we've been silenced by their eloquence. Go ahead, Ross.
So thank you, Hakan. My question is really for you. What struck me in your presentation was the absence in the Qur'an and the Hadith of any notion of punishment associated with plagues. That was quite striking for me, I thought.
All right. Thank you, Ross. I think this is a very good question and very interesting. I should say that there are some prophetic stories in the Quran. There are some prophetic stories which are very relevant to biblical stories as well. And some commentators interpret those stories and punishments in those stories. They refer to plague, all right, ta'un. They interpret that way. You know, actually, as one prophetic tradition says, it was one of the ways of punishment. You know, plague was one of the ways of punishment before, maybe during Israelite periods. And in the Hadith prophetic traditions as well, sometimes plague, this concept refers to punishments. You know, God punished some specific people and tribes because of their behavior, to their prophets or injustice, what they have done. God used this, you know, plague as punishment for some people, but it was in the history for this reason. Now, in today's context, we don't know, because we don't, you know, according to Islamic theology, we don't have a clear, you know, there is no prophet, and we don't have, nobody receives clear revelation, you know, if this plague is a punishment or is, for this reason, these are just interpretations. When we look at Muslim world, some people, some scholars or intellectuals say that this is just a sign, you know, this is a sign, and testing times and reflections it is a part of testing. It is a part of test. Some interpret. There are some others, as Clive indicates, they believe that it is a punishment, and you know, really they refer to some specific places, countries. I do not want to go into much detail. You know, they interpret that way as well. Okay. All right. For example, you're going to talk about, you know, China, for example. You know, China's behavior to, you know, Uyghur Muslims in that region. For this reason, God punished China because of their action. You know, they interpret that way as well. But because these are just interpretations, these are just interpretations. We don't have we don't have we cannot prove this one because nobody receives revelation, but there are diverse there are diverse understandings and interpretations of this pandemic. But Clive summarized very well. We have also in Muslim tradition, in the Muslim world, we have also different understandings and interpretations. But I prefer as a testing time and science in my presentation, but there are also other understandings. But in the history, prophetic traditions, there is a clear concept of punishment, plague as a punishment.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hakan. Sorry, we were out of time.
Thank you, very good question.
Quick comments or question for our Christian speaker?
Can I ask a question, Mansheed, to Clive?
And if we can keep the questions and responses a little bit short, so we're running out of time. Sorry, Suleiman.
Yeah. I was wondering how Christian tradition perceives this pandemic or those kind of discussions in terms of the science for the end of the literature on that.
Well, very quickly, it's certainly true that there have been some writers who have made use of that kind of tradition and would see it as a sign of the end. There, I mentioned John Piper's book, Coronavirus and Christ. What writers like Tom Wright and Co would be saying is that's the wrong kind of question to be asking. It's more a question of how we respond to the neighbor in need at the present time and how we express lament and that sort of thing. So yes, there is a tradition. There are voices, I should say, that are making those claims, but they are also being refuted by other Christians.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We'll have a longer discussion at the end, I promise. But we need to move on. And so we'll hear from our second Christian and Muslim speaker. As I introduced you earlier, Professor Mehmet Ozalp will speak to us now about theological perspective and impact of COVID-19 pandemic on Muslims. So Mehmet, when you're ready.
Okay, I'll just need to share my screen. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for this great opportunity. Thank you, Mansheed. And it's always good to be part of this scriptural reasoning, as it was called, and now sort of Christian-Muslim scholarly dialogue, which is also a very excellent name. I thought I'd talk about, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I wrote an article on the conversation on coronavirus. And I'm going to talk to that article. It's titled How Coronavirus Challenges Muslims' Faith and Changes Their Lives. So my talk is about theological aspects and also the implications of the virus. Maybe if I just zoom the, camera. Well, obviously everybody had to change their lives, including Muslims. So the virus had to adapt to new social norms, basically. Muslims have a very strong family ties. They have sometimes crowded families. So social distancing has been a great challenge. But more broadly, when Muslims meet, they go together by shaking hands and hugging. It was very awkward at the start of the pandemic that do you shake hands, do you hug or not? And then not hugging felt strange, as if you weren't connecting with the person that you were talking to. And then there was an ease of the ease of the lockdown measures. And then do you still hug or not? And I think this is still playing with Muslims on a daily basis. And one of the big things is about visiting the sick. It's a very important Islamic practice. It's actually considered not only a good thing to do, but also almost like an act of worship to visit someone who's sick, pray for them, comfort them. Obviously, in a pandemic, you can't. But not just the pandemic. I've been conflicted on this one with our knowledge of contagious diseases like flu and all that. Like when do you visit somebody because they're sick and when do you don't? We almost need, as Muslims, a new contemporary ethic of visiting the sick. That's always on the back of my mind whenever things like this happen, or someone you hear are sick at home and you cannot visit them because it can be contagious. Obviously, there are diseases that are not contagious, and visiting is not a problem. Now, when coronavirus came out, one of the measures was cleanliness. Personal hygiene was really emphasized. And this is an important part of Islamic personal practice. As Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, cleanliness is half of faith. So it's emphasized a lot in Qur'an and also the prophetic saying, narration. And one of the things that really strikes me was the Muslim emphasis of washing ablutions and washing the hands with also the fingers laced each other. Like there's an emphasis when you describe these in the books. You say when you're washing your hands, make sure you also do it laced between fingers as well. So this was actually recommended by many doctors. So it was very easy for Muslims to adapt to these cleanliness measures or personal hygiene because Muslims are meant to be like that, and it was easy to follow those guidelines. The real impact, other than personal hygiene and social impact, the real impact has been on practices, certain major practices of Islam, and these are like Ramadan, pilgrimage, and Friday services, and the closure of mosques. I don't know of any other period in Muslim history where mosques in the entire world were closed. I don't think that ever happened. It may have happened locally due to various reasons, but it's never happened in the global scale. So that was completely unprecedented. And really Muslims did struggle on that, especially how are you supposed to pray in a congregation. It's always one of the things that the imam or the person who leads the prayer says just before starting a prayer is make sure your rows are tight, your shoulders are touching one another, and it's so much ingrained in the Muslim practice that now even if you're in a mosque today,
don't fill in the gaps.
Don't fill in the gaps.
Yeah, they used to say fill in the gaps.
Fill in the gaps, but now don't fill in the gaps. And then you have to be separated at least 1.5 meters. It does feel strange, to be honest, when you go to these days on Friday prayer, and then you're all separated. But I think we got used to that as well. Muslims got used to it. It's really going to be interesting when you pray next to each other again. That's going to feel strange. But Friday prayers were stopped in April and May, and I think it is still the case in Melbourne, and that was certainly also not done. The Ramadan fell this year in May, which was really at the heart of the lockdown and pandemic. Actually, that was again a very different Ramadan. We're used to inviting one another to break fast in large groups, in homes, in organizations, mosques, and also the invitations that was happening. And this year, we had to break our fast at home with our family, which was great, by the way. We've connected with the family in a way that we've never done before. I think that was one of the big pluses of lockdown in Ramadan. However, you do miss that collective celebration, breaking of the fast, and also there's a nightly prayers in Ramadan, that wasn't done. People had to do that at home on their own. And one of the good things about Islamic practice is that those 5 daily prayers could be conducted anywhere, at home, workplace. So that had no, fortunately, pandemic had no effect. Maybe even it may have made Muslims more focus on the individual prayers and concentration in prayers, which had a meditative effect and hopefully ease down some of the mental impacts of being in lockdown. The pilgrimage was also another major disruption. Pilgrimage happens throughout the year in a lesser pilgrimage, it's called, and so it sort of speeds up closer to Ramadan and peaks in Ramadan, and then goes down a little bit, and then the main pilgrimage season is about a couple of months after Ramadan. So it fell towards the end of early August. So the lesser pilgrimage was stopped in as early as March, and we were all wondering how the main pilgrimage was going to happen. Well, it was cancelled. So it wasn't completely cancelled, but I think they had a couple of thousand people who did the pilgrimage with social distancing strictly applied, and then they were all from within Saudi Arabia, so there was no one from other Muslim countries did the pilgrimage. So if you think about it, more than 2 million people traveled to Saudi Arabia for pilgrimage, and that they couldn't do that this year. And usually the people are on a waiting list. They have to. They're also on a. Sometimes they have to wait 10 years to be able to go to pilgrimage. All those people who waited for a long time missed out. So that's a major disruption to that particular practice of Islam. Now, if I move to the theological aspect, there was an early debate, and so there's really two views on this, or approaches to anything related to something like a pandemic. I think both Hakan and Clive have pointed to these. So there's one approach which is kind of like a fatalistic approach, you might say. Well, before I go there, in Islamic belief, everything in the universe is created by God, and the affairs of the universe is governed by God in real time. So the creation takes place as we know it. It wasn't like universe was not created and then let it run its course. God is in the act of creation every moment. And in one major Muslim scholar, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, even said that, the idea of God creating everything, cosmos, in 6 days, or 6 epochs, he said that there is a 7th day, which is what we're going through right now. So we're in that 7th day God is creating. So if you have that theology, then the implication is of that theology is that, well, the virus is created by God, and therefore God is full knowledge of what's happening, and knowledge, and He's the one who's making these things happen. It's a theodicy question as well. So that's why people, some Muslims tend to say, look for, I guess, wisdom. Well, if God is allowing this or creating this, it must be for a reason to punish. Well, thanks, Mansheed. 5 minutes.
Noise, if it can be stopped.
Sorry, close it?
There's a clicking mouse noise.
Oh, okay. Right, so it was to warn and punish. Well, some people are of the view that, well, it's a pandemic, it's something, people are dying, people are getting sick, it's disrupting the economy in the world, or the modern life, as we know it, has been disrupted in a way that's never been done before. So this must be a warning and a punishment from God. So this might mean that fighting the pandemic is futile, and people should just rely, which is tawakkul, there's an Arabic word for that, on God to protect the righteous so that they're not harmed. But the thing is, you know, people are dying, they're righteous or not, you know, they're dying everywhere. It does not distinguish between innocent or guilty or not righteous. So the way to really get around this issue is really there's a very important explanation to this, or theological perspective, that God does not primarily create things on earth to punish people. In a sense that everything is really there primarily to maintain the balance of life, or the conditions on earth favorable for life, so that life can continue. Like, for example, like earthquakes, right? If an earthquake happens and a city is destroyed, one could say, well, God is punishing the people in that city. But the thing is, earthquakes were happening when there was no humans on earth as well. So were they there to punish the dinosaurs, you know? I don't want to take it lightly, this issue, but the thing is that earthquakes happen primarily because of the tectonic movements, and that the tectonic movements are there to preserve a very favorable Earth's crust and shape the landscape on Earth over time, which is really a creative act of God. And then when that's released, and earthquakes happen. So that's the reason why it happens. So hurricanes, for example, hurricanes, usually happen start in equator and then move up northwards. It's a very fast way of transmitting heat, so that the Earth does not overheat around the equator, and that the average temperature on Earth is more or less maintained. It just so happens that you're on the way of the Mansheed, you're on the way of the hurricane, and your house might get damaged. Again, hurricanes were happening even before there was humans on Earth. So these natural events, and you could throw in that viruses and the single cell life forms on Earth are there for a reason. They're extremely important for maintaining the life and the conditions of life on Earth. But a byproduct of these is that they cause disease, and that sometimes when those diseases jump to human beings, especially from animals, and we have these uncontrolled pandemics. So that is a very important theological position in my view. But there's also another one, the third one, that where people, sort of Muslims are, and this is the majority, by the way, the Muslims are saying that, well, even though God creates these viruses and all the biology that produces them as well, it's really human beings are responsible for their spread. So it is in our power to spread it or not. It's a bit like when, I think when Hakan said, they gave the example of Caliph Omar. When he went to Syria, they asked him, why aren't you entering the city? And they, don't you believe in the destiny of God, the qadr of God? And he says, well, I'm running away. Are you running away from the qadr of God, meaning God's decree? And Omar says, I'm running away from qadr of God to qadr of God. Because either way, to enter or not, and whatever I choose becomes the decree of God, or that human choice is very important, and it was debated in Islamic theology a lot, and the far majority of belief is Muslims believe that the human will is a very important part of God's operation, especially in human realms, and that should not be negated when we're explaining things. Just one final thing is that this idea of life being a test is important. It enables people to be more resilient through when they're going through suffering. And it might even be okay, it might be okay for an individual who's going through suffering to say, God is punishing me. If that means that they're going to transform themselves and for the better, and they will change for the better. But someone else, me, who's not suffering from a disease, should not go to someone who is, visit them and says, you know, what have you done? God is punishing you. So that would be really judgmental for me to say that as an individual. So individuals in their subjective reality can say, this is God's punishment on me. There's nothing wrong with that. It's but we should not really claim anything as an outright God's punishment on whole humanity. Although our actions, if our actions are causing it, we are really punishing ourselves. Thank you very much, and I hope that was useful.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mehmet. So let's give him a virtual round of applause, everybody. Okay, excellent. So fantastic. Now this brings us to our next and final speaker for this afternoon, to hear from our Christian speaker, Professor Stephen Pickard. Pickard from the Public and Contextual Theology. So Stephen, over to you when you're ready. Mehmet, you can stop sharing. And following that, we'll have a short Q&A and go into our breakout rooms. So you're on mute still, Stephen. I can unmute you, I think, or you can unmute yourself.
How's that?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Right, here we go. Thank you very much, everybody, for this initiative. It's great. My apologies for not getting my my topic to you on time, but my topic is leadership and solitude in COVID-19 time. A couple of things about this, just briefly. First of all, it does pick up a couple of themes flagged in various ways by our speakers. Hakan, towards the end, he mentioned the issue of contemplation. Clive, on very interesting and helpful critique of Tom Wright on the problem of quietism and the lack of the prophetic, and Mehmet on his reflections on practices and what has happened to practices in our religious traditions. This is my question that I have in relation to what I want to speak about. Is it possible that the cultivation of solitude might provide some resources for a more robust prophetic leadership in the church and society? So I want to take on very directly the question of lament, the groaning of creation, the quietism that could generate, and see whether there are some deeper resources in our Christian tradition, and I also believe in other religious traditions, for a more prophetic, robust leadership that arises out of the cultivation of solitude. I admit that I'm coming at this matter about COVID-19 and responses somewhat obliquely. I'm very concerned with the contemporary challenges that COVID-19 has, and for leadership in institutions, whether they be in church, other religious traditions and their leaders, particularly in the political realm, the way in which leadership in our time is resorting very quickly to the blame game. We have some very contemporary recent examples of that, even in Australia with states versus federal, and there's always money behind it. The politicization, in other words, of the pandemic, and if there are some wiser traditions that we should draw upon. I'm also very struck with the Epicurean option that Tom Wright mentioned. I think Clive's absolutely right about that and how it functions. So, can I address this matter directly? We live in transitional and turbulent times. This is not confined to the West. It's a feature across the nations and the peoples of the world. And the changes taking place are comprehensive and they're insistent. and they cover a whole range of social, economic, political, and spiritual dimensions of our life. And institutions and the loyalties once associated with them are under stress. The planet's under stress, and this impacts on our humanity. Inequalities across the globe are increasing. There are new global alignments that are occurring at a pace, and the movement of people across the world continues to rise. And from this perspective, the Christian church is not immune from such developments. How could it be otherwise? There is a veritable industry of commentary on what is happening to the world of the 21st century, and the recent challenges of COVID-19 global pandemic have also raised some acute existential questions for institutions, their role, their fitness and purpose, and how they should be led. And so I want to offer a brief reflection on the theme of institutional leadership in COVID-19 time, with a particular focus on the church and the practice of solitude. What kind of leadership? Well, what kind of leadership is required to help people in institutions navigate the times we're living in and the rate of change and the uncertainty? How do leaders avoid quick fix responses or responses that are driven by political expediency rather than for care of people and the institutions that they inhabit? The anxieties of host cultures are reflected for the most part in organizations and institutions, and this includes the church. You have a lot of knee-jerk reactions that pander to populist voices. They may sound authorial and decisive, but they fail to offer the kind of leadership required for the occasion. And what we often experience is an obsession with the next strategic move. It can feel at times like we're moving deck chairs on a very unstable Titanic. In the light of the above, what is required of leaders? My concern is particularly focused on those who are followers of the Christian way, whether in churches, politics, business, or any walk of life. A pandemic can shake us up and disturb our equilibrium. Indeed, COVID-19 is a disrupted time. It's a testing time. It's a strange time. It's anything but ordinary time. And perhaps for the foreseeable future, COVID-19 time is destined to become the new ordinary time. So what resources are available for leaders of institutions that will make for the endurance and the stamina required for the long haul? If we are attentive, I think we can discern a call to dig a little deeper in these times, to uncover hitherto untapped and surprising resources available to the human creature. In particular, I'm interested to know if it is possible for leaders to cultivate the habit of solitude, to seek a more considered, wise and calm engagement with the imponderables of our times, and to do it in such a way which is for the good of society. And I think this is at least a calling in my own tradition, as it bears witness to its prophet, priest and leader, Jesus Christ. And there are many false tracks on leadership for certain. There's no way around that. One option has the strong populist appeal to install a charismatic leader or demagogue who promises much more than can ever be delivered. And we see that occurring around the globe and especially in the Western world. It's a kind of a top-down bossing approach to leadership. In the manner of the current US president, this kind of leadership heightens rather than diminishes societal and cultural trauma, and the effects of which will be felt for a generation or two at least. Another option is the manager-type leader. We're afflicted with that in many institutions and general culture. There is associated with this manager-type leader a general lack of vision and capacity to navigate change. It's usually masked by an overexertion in reordering current arrangements as a way of coping with rapid change and uncertainty and struggles and pandemics. The emergence of the executive manager as an institutional leader is a familiar feature of most Western institutions, but it too has roots in anxiety that envelops much contemporary life and pressing need to manage what is perceived to be unstable, rivalrous, brittle. It's an attractive substitute for richer notions of leadership. And so, not surprisingly, in these kind of options for leadership, either the top-down bossing, demagogue kind of way, authorial, or the managerial type, both invest heavily in relocating responsibility via blame and scapegoating. Both these options indicate a failure of nerve when it comes to the exercise of genuine leadership. And right now we need that. The dangers of not operating from a place of authenticity, and I mean here, the God who is truly revealed in the Christian tradition for Christians in Christ and the scriptures, and understood and faithfully embodied in actual concrete practices of leadership and service. When we're not operating as the Christian church out of that place of authenticity, it means that the actual authority of leaders will depreciate and deteriorate. The exercise of power will not be an adequate substitute for this loss of authenticity. Identifying such patterns of dysfunctional behaviour in leaders is not particularly difficult. It's all around us. And it's close by us. It's closer than the air we breathe because we manifest it in our own lives. I certainly have experienced that. What is easily missed is the fundamental framework informed by economic concerns for productivity of goods to feed a highly materialistic and consumer-orientated market. In this context, the ends justify the means, and the ethos seeps into the systems of exchange in such a manner that persons are always in danger of being reduced to units of production in the service of profits and notions of progress that generate greater inequalities. Well, I don't want to bang on about this. It's quite familiar to you. The results of this kind of leadership are plain to see at the personal level in lives and careers destroyed or paralysed, and at the institutional level, such leadership generates a breakdown in trust and confidence. The church is a case in point in this. The nature of its hierarchically ordered patterns of authority and the significant diversity of forms of this ordering are complex, and they resist identification. Well, not surprisingly then, what makes and forms leaders for the well-being of the people of God will be the reservoirs of compassion and empathy, a capacity to operate with suppleness and firmness, forgiveness and discipline, seeing God work through our own weaknesses, not just the strengths and attributes we may cherish. I recall reading an article some years ago regarding criteria for a bishop, and the author posed 6 questions that could be asked of any would-be Episcopal leader, but it was the first question that struck me. What have you done with your suffering? It's a great question. I've never heard it asked though. In the light of the current COVID-19 pandemic, I wondered about another question though, pertinent, I hope, to anyone in leadership. What have you done with your solitude? Now, it may sound an odd question, but it arises out of the so-called social distancing and enforced isolation of people and communities. Some experience this as a time of increased loneliness. This is not the same as aloneness. We can be alone but not lonely. We can be immersed in social relations but extremely lonely. Being alone opens up the possibilities of discovering the world of solitude, which can be restorative and energizing. Recent writings on loneliness and aloneness and solitude highlight the interesting interplay between these 3 experiences and how they might be relevant to times of isolation. One reviewer, and I found this very interesting review of books on loneliness and solitude in the May edition of The Economist, of all places. The reviewer of these books in The Economist notes that the human instinct to socialize has always been balanced by an urge to withdraw into solitude. It was Aristotle who referred to solitude as the bird which flies alone. And the British writer, John Powers, comments that it is only the cultivation of interior solitude among crowded lives that makes society bearable. David Vincent, another author in this edition, notes that the rise of modern technology is both a blessing and a curse, having on the one hand introduced us to networked solitude, yet on the other hand, making it more difficult to enjoy the benefits of solitude. So we've all experienced this, and we're in one right now. I mean, welcome to Zoom land. It is both refreshing at times and connecting, and also exhausting. David Vincent notes that distraction is only a click away. A surveillance culture is hard to escape from the solitude that is an endangered species. And the reviewer comments that the lockdown and associated social isolation has put the question of solitude at the heart of politics. On the one hand, it has highlighted the tragedy of those dying alone, while for others, it has proved a strange blessing. Perhaps, therefore, the solitude of the ancient monastics, and this is where I want to come to the resources of the religious traditions and the Christian tradition out of which I speak, the solitude of the ancient monastics has much to teach today's busy and anxious society and their leaders. The practice of solitude might be that missing ingredient necessary for the wisdom of leadership in times of uncertainty and crisis. My sense is that leaders who have made friends with their aloneness and have entered into the gift of solitude have a resource to offer others beyond the anxieties of loneliness. One practical consequence can be observed in the non-anxious leader who does not mask their own insecurities by appeal to well-worn and meaningless speech. Instead, such leaders have the capacity to both empathize with the anxieties of people and offer a calm and resolute voice which does not ignore the tough realities that people face. This kind of habit does not come from a leadership course, nor is it achieved via professional development, as useful as these might be. Rather, it emerges from the encounter with one's own loneliness, experience of isolation and aloneness, and the more fruitful and character-building journey into solitude. Periods of transition and instability require leaders who are adept at helping people and institutions, firstly, to navigate the transitions that are occurring, secondly, to live with uncertainties of the times, and thirdly, to infuse a sense of hope, which breeds resilience that is neither cheap nor shallow. Such leadership involves a unique blend of top-down and bottom-up approaches to leadership. It is invariably collaborative and embodies the time-worn virtues and gifts of the Spirit espoused in the Christian tradition. Such leadership is always costly. It requires resilience and mercy, wisdom and discernment of the times, a deep and loving understanding of people, a realistic and humble assessment of the human condition, an emotional and spiritual maturity born of the habit of solitude, and capacity to collaborate with others as a way forward is crafted. Does Holy Scripture and the Christian tradition provide paradigms for the wisdom leadership needs? The New Testament invites us to pattern leadership in relation to service and leadership lived out of the virtues of self-emptying and humility, of self-dispossession, of faithful and prayerful attention to those who may hate the leader as well as those who might follow them. The Old Testament offers multiple examples of faithfulness in adversity, risk-taking, and counterintuitive wisdom that confounds the world. In the context of this reflection on the leader, I am drawn to the gospel stories of Jesus as one who sought times of aloneness and solitude. It was part of the mix of a life constantly being regenerated and focused on the task and calling that was before him. In times such as these, which for many have been lonely and frightening, for some strangely renewing in their resolve for a new way of life, the cultivation of the habit of solitude can provide leaders with a new composure and strength. As leaders are drawn deeper into the purposes of God and exemplify this in their life, the very nearness of the Most High God becomes a living reality for many more, for the people of God and the institutions that they serve. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Stephen. Let's give Stephen a virtual round of applause. He talked about Zoom. Excellent. Thank you. That was really wonderful insights on leadership as well. So we have briefly now time for just two quick comments / questions to our speakers. I think it's as we can see that, you know, this forum has become now very relevant to our contemporary times, where we're drawing inspiration from our faith traditions to guide, inspire, you know, society, politics, leadership, and a whole heap of other things. So who would like to, if anyone has a pressing question for our Muslim speaker and our Christian speaker, please raise your hand. You can also type your question. There were a few comments. I'll bring them up again in the breakout rooms from Amelia, Daria, and a couple of others. Any questions for our Muslims or Christian speakers? Okay, Professor Salih Ujel, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for the important leadership issue. I think it's very important. I was reading in an article about leadership during the pandemic. One of the Dr. Mongari, who was working in Istanbul in the mid 19th century during the pandemic, he wrote that politics and money kill more than pandemics. Do you agree? And what do you think about that?
Totally. There was a very interesting comment I saw on Huffington Post, which I'm addicted to, a couple of months ago. It said, apparently, death and the mass deaths are bad for the economy. The whole juxtaposition, the dialectic between dealing with the suffering of people and the sense that we must keep the economy going. Well, both are true, but there is a dialectic between these two, and I'm very concerned about the politicization of the pandemic for the purposes of, you know, the whole economic engine driving on. But that's not a simple solution. So I think he's probably right.
Thanks,
Thank
Steve.
you.
There is another question about if you're a chaplain to Scott Morrison, but we may come back to that. That's a good one. A question from Amelia for Mehmet in the chat. Thanks, Amelia. She's saying, how is ongoing or continuing concept of prophetic work in Islam? Mehmet, if you'd like to respond to that.
So what's the question? Sorry, I don't have.
Talk to your question if you like.
Yeah, I think for Christians, we probably think of the ongoing work of prophetic work as one of the points of mission for the church. But I'm wondering whether or not there's a sense of continuing revelation prophetic work in Islam in the same way.
Okay. Well, probably it may not be good to compare the Christian concept, but there is the idea of a prophet's mission or role continues, not as a channel of revelation from God to humanity, but in its role for humanity, that is preserving the religion, transmitting religion to future generations, representing that religious teachings in an ideal way, is very much an important concept for Muslims. And actually a lot of the movements in the Muslim world at this point in time would claim that they are doing prophetic role. That is, what would Prophet do if he was alive in our time is a question often asked by Muslims. And obviously he would teach religion, he would educate people, call people, invite people to belief and worship of God and doing good, which is the fundamental message of all prophets, by the way, that invitation of human beings to believe in God, worship God and do good. So anyone who invites Muslims, sorry, not just Muslims, but invites humanity to this cause, to this message, is fulfilling a prophetic role without the title of having a prophet, being a prophet. So that mission definitely continues. Yeah. And also there's a very famous saying or attributed to Prophet Muhammad that he says, there will not be any prophet after me, but God will send a renewer of every 100 years. So someone will come who will renew your religion for you. That's usually understood, mujaddid, the word is mujaddid, and that's understood as, again, not a prophet, but doing that role, having major contributions to, making major contributions to religion, and especially for Muslims, and updating the Muslims' understanding of Islam, making it more relevant for their time. So that relevance of religion is very important in Islam.
Thank you. And I think Daria said scholars are the inheritors of prophets, and she's quoted that hadith. Thank you, Daria. Okay, guys, so we're about to go into breakout rooms. Now, I've created a room for Christian scholars and then Muslim scholars to discuss individually. But does anybody have any pressing comments, quick comments, urging? I know Clive had that wonderful question about being a chaplain to Stephen, or Scott Morrison's chaplain. But any other comments or questions, points? No? We're ready to discuss internally. So what will happen is I will automatically, you'll go into your room. And then you'll be given 15 minutes to discuss and digest from within your tradition and what you've heard. And then we'll come back and continue our discussion and end it there. Okay, is that all clear, the instructions? Yeah, okay, let's go for it. I hope this works. Bismillah. Okay, I think you need to accept it. Yeah. To accept the invitation to go to your room. Yeah. Ah, Isra Sydney room.
Mansheed, where are we?
You didn't come up. How do I add you?
Oh, okay. Just one. Can you do it again?
You have to join it, is it?
Unit accept. Yeah.
Can you?
I don't know how to add you. Can you join through Hakan's one?
Yeah. Okay. So we'll mute there.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Sorry, Mansheed, thank you very much for today. I have to leave the meeting now.
No worries. Thanks, Anne, for attending. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
I know how to do that. Muslim scholars. Maybe add. I don't know. How do I NA join? Brother Mehmet and Hakan, maybe you want to mute yourselves. Unmute the Isra room when you get out of your room.
Okay, no, it's unmuted.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody. Good we didn't lose everyone. How did you all go? So I think how we can move through this is maybe we can have a respondent from each of the sessions to just give us a quick rundown. I think Suha was going to give us a quick rundown, and then we'll go into some discussions before we wrap up. So from the Christian side, hope you had wonderful discussions. Would anyone like to give us like a summary of your discussion? What stood out to you or what you discussed, the juicy parts?
Juicy parts. No pressure.
Ross, why don't you pick up the thing about the gender issue and prophets and leadership?
Oh yeah, go on, Stephen.
Well, I was asking Ross to do it because he was on a roll right at the end when we got sent to this room.
Well, we spent a lot of time thinking about what would be a prophetic voice in this particular context, and maybe why perhaps the churches haven't been as effective as they might have been in bringing that voice to the discussion. So that's a kind of internal Christian discussion about, you know, where churches are now and the way they've enmeshed with some of the, you know, sort of power structures and the kind of corporate culture of our society. And then at the end, we were also thinking about whether this provides an opportunity, partly in response to Stephen's paper, about to look at the roles of leadership in our what constitutes a sort of leadership culture. And I was referring to, I don't know if anyone else heard it, but there's a very good program on the ABC where they were looking at why some of the societies that seem to have done best in the culture have female leaders and a kind of political system that's quite comfortable with those sort of roles, whereas some of the societies that seem to have done worst have a very sort of macho, patriarchal kind of leadership culture. You know, you can think of the United States or Brazil or Britain and so forth, and whether part of the discussion, in addition to prophecy, is also using this as an opportunity to keep the discussion going about what kind of leadership ethos and we need in our society, and that's part of the learning out of all of this.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. Yeah, anyone want to respond to that from the Muslim, or we can continue this discussion maybe, and then we'll hear from Suha, or should we hear from Suha first? Where's Suha? Sorry. Oh, there you are. Okay, let's park this then. So I really like this discussion because I think we touched on Stephen's paper as well. I think it's relevant in terms of leadership as well. We drew out different aspects of it. Suha, did you want to give us a recap and then we'll have a collective discussion? Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Stephen, we really enjoyed your paper and started speaking about that. We touched on loneliness actually and brought out that the positive aspects are that, from a Muslim perspective, you're praying 5 times a day at home in a group situation, and the home turns into a mosque in that respect, and that's got a positive impact on the family. But the negative is that we're sort of not focusing on as a community and society generally the negative aspects, people who have lost their jobs, the mental illness issues that are happening, being at home with children all day, that these are real perspectives, and we felt that that's not being touched upon at a societal level. We then started speaking about this suffering, patience, and the signs. We were saying that we had quite similar concepts between the Muslim and the Christian perspective. And then we went into the discussion of that some Muslims and some Christians see the pandemic as a sign of the end of the times, that, global pandemics, the widespread nature of them is a sign of the end of times. One of our members mentioned what the head of the World Health Organization said, that we should, as humanity, start getting ready for more of these global pandemics. One of our members was interested in delving more into what the Christian tradition says about this, because it's in our prophetic tradition that you know, one of the signs of the end of time are the increase in these sorts of pandemics. The book that was mentioned by Dr. Hakan Ibn Hajar's book about pandemics, actually, in the preface of that book, it goes into, at the time that it was written, information was sought from Muslim doctors, non-Muslim doctors. There were opinions on whether the pandemics are a punishment or not. They mentioned that these sorts of things can be spread through air. So there was quite a forward-thinking aspect that came out in that book. We then went on to speaking about the Black Plague, and in the 14th century it was mentioned that 20% of the world population died. That would equate to 1.5 billion of us on Earth presently dying, but that potentially through the advancement of medicine and hopefully a vaccine coming very soon, the cost today or in the future may not be in human life, but it will be to the economy and the marketplace. So what we were saying is that there's going to be a cost, and I think that resonates with both religions, that God will, that there will be suffering on earth, but how that plays out is different. It could be loss of life, it could be loss of economy and other aspects. And that a famous Muslim commentator in England, Abdul Hakim Murad, has described the pandemic as a warning for capitalist life. Then we sort of finally were interested in what the Christian experience has been to worship. Do you all think that post-pandemic or post-lockdown that there will be increased numbers in church, or that it will be the same, better? One member from our group was saying that they feel that the attendance at mosques has increased since lockdown was lifted. So yeah, we were just interested to see what the Christian view was. And we just finally ended on the sage advice from our teacher, Dr. Yücel, that we should never stoop to blame anyone for these viruses. And he reminded us of the Jews who were killed in Europe because they were seen as the cause of the I think it was one of the plagues that came there, that, you know, it's not any one individual's fault. So they were the myriad of topics that we spoke about.
Thanks, Suha. Let's get some Christian brothers and sisters responding now, if they can, if you'd like to. Anyone? To any of the topics, the messianic question, the prophetic question, gender related to Suha's comments. I think
the church attendance, can someone respond to that? Like, what's the church attendance like?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I'm the anthropologist, I guess. So generally across Australia, at least, the interest in things spiritual has increased dramatically, and so there's much higher attendance, if you want to call it that, at prayers or at worship across churches, but less specific commitment to individual communities. So many people are going online and connecting with a range of different worship services, but not necessarily the same community all the time. So that also skews our statistics quite considerably, because we may count the same person 5 times because they've actually attended 5 different services in 5 different communities online.
Wow.
Okay.
So there's a greater need for more services.
Well, it's been very interesting to see how much of that shopping and hopping, as we would call it, has gone. We probably won't know more about that until we get some work done by the Christian Research Association and by the the research groups about who's doing what, because it's too easy to miscount the numbers when a lot of what's happening for us is done through Facebook Live or live streams and things like that. And so somebody can go online and they get counted in the numbers of views and searches, but in fact it's a person who's just leaving on 5 different services during the course of the Sunday. You know?
Are any physical church things happening, services?
In some denominations, there are physical gatherings, and so because of restrictions, that has been often people have been moving into midweek services. So Patricia might want to say more about the Catholic situation, but midweek masses have done quite well, whereas for a lot of the groups who hold Sunday worship as their primary thing, there's more activity online than there is live in person. So we know from research around the world that one of the principal spreaders of the disease has been churches. And in the US, as an example, in the 2 weeks following Easter Sunday, when many churches decided to gather even with restrictions, there were 29 ministers, pastors, priests died in the first 2 weeks after Easter Sunday in the US. And that was because they were present in those communities and the spread was so great in worship services. So at the moment we're conducting a global research project around the World Methodists, which is feeding into World Council of Churches research about what the statistics are in different parts of the world around digital attendance.
Thanks, Amelia.
Could I just add something to that?
Yep, who is that? Go ahead.
Jonathan.
Yep, go ahead, Jonathan.
I'll just say this is an anecdotal personal experience, but I would say it's possibly too soon to know what the long-term consequences for church attendance are going to be, because based on the current permissions in Canberra, where I live, we have the 1 person per 4 square metre rule up to 100 people, or whichever number is lower. So in my church, that only gives us a maximum of 50 people, which is less than our congregation, and the church can hold up to 100. But just because of it's an older church and it's tightly packed, and so we do have a Sunday service again, which is nothing like the old service. There's no singing and a whole bunch of other restrictions, but you have to book to go because only 50 people can go. And so I imagine quite a few churches must be in that situation. And whether once the restrictions are ended, we're stuck with 50 people, or whether we go back to 80 to 100 remains to be seen.
Thanks, Jonathan. Now I'd like to go back to Ross's comment, if we can. If anyone else would like to pick that up in relation to leadership. I think you mentioned the gender issue. I wonder if it's to do with the quality of compassion which is lacking in our leaderships, perhaps around the world, or some of the qualities, because both Christians and Muslims are waiting for Jesus to come back. And what are the qualities of Christ? What are qualities of the Messiah, Jesus? And I think as a non-Christian, as a Muslim, what stands out to me, it's his compassion, his his love and all that. So I wonder if we need some of these qualities in leadership. What do others think? And I think females have that compassion naturally. Maybe I'm biased.
No, you are right.
I think Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand has been held up as one of the examples of leadership, talking about compassion, kindness, and particularly in response to the Christchurch mosque shootings and what's happened since with the sentencing. She uses the word kindness a lot, and that's what resonated with people around the world.
So I read in a Turkish article that she is the caliph.
Caliph of compassion.
Yes.
That's a good one. Okay.
Can I just say, Rossi, I think it also has to do with the way in which we sort of frame problems, and that a certain sort of leadership wants to be able to prove that they've got a solution, whether it's a technical solution or a solution by virtue of taking, you know, clear action or something like that, and that kind of leadership really struggles in the face of, you know, really intractable, very deep and complex problems that aren't amenable to sort of easy or easy technical solutions, and how to find a way of leading people through that. And I think to me, that resonates with a lot of the discussion here, which is, you know, while we want to sort of point prophetically to some of the deep problems that people have created, there is also the need to be able to, you know, walk with people through times of suffering, rather than to hold out the sort of notion that if we're just strong in our actions, or, you know, find the technical answer or something, we'll be able to solve all the problems. And I think they're the people who are tending to be really found wanting actually in this situation, whereas the people who are more, at least project a style of leadership which is more about walking with people through, you know, really challenging, difficult times, are proving actually more effective.
Absolutely. Zaleha wanted to say
Yeah, I guess adding on to what Ross is saying, I feel that there's a bit of a mismatch between the leadership that we've seen very historically, as in the prophetic leadership, and it goes back to what you're saying, Mansheed, and the leadership that we're seeing in some of the figures today. And historically, like you mentioned, compassion and wisdom were a big part of it, and it was very human-centric. You know, the economy was always secondary. Humans were the first priority, whereas what we're seeing now in the leadership, you know, whether, you know, let's say Scott Morrison or Trump, it's all about the economy. And obviously it's important, but it's not more important than human beings. And I guess this is where compassion is very important. You know, being money-driven or power-driven, which a capitalist system is nurturing, is not the right way to go. So they're in a way a product of their society, I feel like, our current leaders, but it's not a good enough, it's not a justification for what they are. Yeah, so I do see a huge mismatch between, let's say, the male leadership that we're seeing today as in compared to the male leadership that we saw historically. It's a big problem.
If I may comment as well, Mansheed, I think just explaining good leadership with gender is a bit of a pitfall, and it may not be good. I mean, because we've got, you know, Belgium, for example, has one of the highest death rates in Europe. It has a female prime minister. You know, how do you explain that? So, whereas, you know, some of the best countries that have responded have male leaders. So I don't think we should explain it with gender, but it's more the competence and leadership qualities that we're looking for. Are really what should be emphasized, and also the prime ministers. Maybe the leadership we're talking about has many levels. You know, leaders as like religious leaders, social leaders, community leaders, but the leaders of countries, their job is to look after the economy. One of their key role. So they do need to. I'm not here justifying thinking of economy. Certainly, like in Australia, Scott Morrison, although I don't support him politically, by announcing like JobKeeper and like $700 billion or something, that's going to be very bad for the economy to give all that money away. But that may have stopped a total collapse of economy as well. So we don't really know. There's the Great Depression in 1930s, where the world has learned a lot from that. Like somebody has to spend. There's I think Keynesian, economy. If the government doesn't spend, then nobody does, and therefore the entire economy collapses. So that's why they jumped in early and provided JobKeeper. Yeah, it's not an easy thing, that one. The leadership of a country.
Yeah. We live in tough times, absolutely. I would like to give our Christian brothers and sisters an opportunity to respond, and then that will be the final comment. I think we've really breached our time. Sorry, bad timekeeper here. So any Christians who haven't spoken yet would like to make a final comment in relation to what we've said. Silence means we're ready to go home. We are home, ironic. Okay, guys, before I let you go, and I am about to let you go, I would like to invite Professor Clive Pearson to do a book launch for us. And this is a great win for the public in contextual theology and for the academic world. His book is called Enacting a Public Theology, which some of you have presented papers on. So over to you, Clive.
Well, thank you, Mansheed, and thank you very much for hosting our time together. This book was actually due to be launched when we were going to meet back in March, when we were going to have our first scriptural reasoning day, but that didn't become possible. So this is it. It's not really a launch. I'm just advertising. I put down on the chat the name and the cost if you're interested, and also my email address whereby you can contact me. This represents articles that were presented at the Stellenbosch Conference of Public Theology, and it includes articles by Stephen, Mehmet on the care of creation from an Islamic perspective, myself and Peter Walker, and from Seth Carroll and one or two others that we know well. So just making that text known. There's been no chance of having a formal book launch, but this, this is in effect it. So I've written down the references there for you if anyone's interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you for that, and congratulations to you all. And thank you for being a wonderful audience, everybody, and to our speakers once again, Clive, Mehmet, Hakan, Stephen, fantastic speeches from all of you, and to all of your other Christian brothers and sisters and Muslims for attending. We hope to see you next year. Keep in touch, be safe, and I think there's a lot of wisdom shared today. Digest it as you have a lunch break now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mansheed. Excellent sharing. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you very much
care,
indeed.
everyone. See you.
I'm looking forward to next time, but we don't have lunch today.
No lunch. Oh.
Yeah.
Take care, everyone.